okay, so I want to transition to problems and solutions. You had all that exposure, um, and you began to identify. Probably, I'm assuming. I'm not going to put words in your mouth. You tell me where I'm wrong. But you began to identify probably some common trends around inflection points gone awry, or pivot points gone awry, or decisions that perhaps were made or not made that had consequences, right? So fast forward to Blackstone and the launch of Treehill Partners coming out of Blackstone. You formed up this mission at Treehill to work in the biotech white spaces, and I'm assuming those white spaces are those areas where there's criticality of decision making or lack of decision making that you recognize, what the right decision or solution might be. Tell me, like,
if I back up for a second, so if you don't mind, I'm going to answer your question a slightly different way. Anybody who sits here and says, I can see a white space and no one else can, I can do things better than you can, is someone that shouldn't be on a podcast and shouldn't be talking to too many human beings. So
you regret my use of the term soothsayer and my rambling.
No. So anybody who says so we got to the right point, but we didn't get to the right point because of there wasn't a deliberate, conscious, anti-grade pathway to getting to the right point. Because anybody who says that I knew I was going to sit here and I knew I was going to work with companies and prevent them making mistakes and help them get out of difficulty is someone who is drinking their own Kool-Aid. So I'm hopefully a lot more honest and transparent that at Goldman, if you'd asked me what is the probability of success for a phase 3 product, I'd say 50%. What is the probability of success for a phase 2? I'd say 25%. I took that as gospel. I had always assumed that the 50% that failed because the molecule didn't perform and didn't have the results needed to move forward. As I moved on to Blackstone, for example, I started seeing there is a trend of a lot of companies that are being given advice, including by us, where we're saying to them, you want to achieve A or B. So let's use the Olympics as an example. You want to get to the Olympics in 4 years' time in LA. Your chances of getting to the Olympics are 2%, 5%, 10%, 20%, 100%, whatever it is. And this is what you need to do to get to that point. What we found is those companies receive that information and go, but what do you want me to do with it? I've never done it before. I don't have the capabilities internally to do it. Can you roll up your sleeve and actually work with me to help me get to that point? So stop being the lecturer, but actually roll up your sleeves and work with us. So when we formed Treehill Partners in 2014, what we did is we took me with a scientific and medical background. We took Max with a thoroughbred pedigree investment banking. We took the former head of BD&L at AstraZeneca, former head of M&A at Allergan, and put 4 people into a team where we had a lens. Everyone had a scientific and or medical background. AstraZeneca colleague had 25, 30 years worth of experience of large cap pharma. Allergan had 20 years worth of experience of how specialty pharma does it. And between us, we thought that we could help companies more than a Goldman banker, for example, or on different things, because we had operational and scientific and banking backgrounds, in addition to a solid investment banking offering. When we then realized that it's very difficult to get someone to hire Treehill when there is hundreds of other investment banking boutiques. There are lots of very good investment banks, and we had a network and we were able to generate revenue. But I realized very quickly, or we realized as a team, we need to have an offering which really can't be replicated. So what we did is, same as medicine, if you're trying to build a reputation as a doctor, you find the patient that no one else wants to operate on, nobody else wants to see. You're in a resuscitation room where you've got the patients who are 5 minutes away from death. That's how you build your reputation, which is exactly what I did in medicine. I was the one who was in the resuscitation room. I was the one operating on the most difficult, sickest patients, because that's how I wanted to build my reputation. So in version one of Treehill, we set up a boutique and we said, look, this would be great. I mean, we made some mandates, we made some money. And I thought, we're not going to grow from this. This is a highly competitive market with lots of very good competitors. What do people not want to do? They didn't want to deal with difficult companies and difficult situations where, the trial had read out. So we built a restructuring franchise. And over the past a decade or so, we've done over 100 corporate turnarounds, companies that have had share price declines of 50, 60, 70%, where you step in as a parachute in as a team, where you say, okay, this is how you deal with your debt holders. This is how you deal with the equity holders. This is how this is the PR you go out with. This is the IR you go out with. This is how you go back to your PI when it comes to the study. This is the non-deal roadshow you put in place. This is how we change the website. And because we've done it over 100 times, we get parachuted into very difficult situations. And within a week, we're part of the fabric of that company because we've seen it when it goes wrong and we've seen it repeatedly. Did we want to go into that situation? Honestly, no, that's not where we started out to, but we realized that no advisory firm was in that position. Then there's a second, so that's version 2 of Treehill. Version 3 was, we were seeing 100 companies out of just say 1,000 who had been in difficult situations. And we thought to ourselves, okay, this is the unfortunate 50% of companies that fail in phase 3, for example. So going back to Goldman, at Goldman, we were saying, I'm not talking about Goldman, I'm talking about Ali within Goldman. At Goldman, we'd say 50% of drugs fail because it's the drug's fault. Mm-hmm. Now, roll the clock forward, 15, 20 years, you now start seeing a pattern of companies that have failed. And you ask yourself the question, maybe it's not the molecule. Maybe it's the way we've developed that molecule which has led to the failure. Maybe it's a clinical trial design that has led to that failure. And we were fortunate enough to work with a number of the global CROs. So now you're seeing the sausage being made. And we realized, and this is an aha moment that came in 20 years after kind of going into banking, where you go, I can see why you made a decision in your phase 2A, which I, as a banker, would have seen 5 or 6 years down the road that would have led you down the wrong pathway. So step 1 is learn to be a banker. Step 2 is, once it's gone wrong, how do you try and fix it? Step 3 is, what decisions led to that mistake? So if you look at Treehill today, we can now sit with a company and we can say, okay, it's a healthy company and the company wants to develop a product in a certain indication. You're now running the binomial tree in an anti-grade manner. You need to do this, 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 and you will get to the target product profile that you desire. That target product profile will need to have certain characteristics, which means that by the time of launch, which might be 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, the competitive landscape means that target product profile is competitive. And companies will say, okay, that's great. So you'll work with me on TPP delineation at the time of launch. Then they say, what is my clinical development pathway? So what is my CDP that then leads me to that TPP? And we can work with companies in an anti-grade manner and say, okay, you want to go into breast, you want to go into pancreatic, you want to go into whatever the indications, whether ophthalmology or other indications. These are the steps that you need to take between here and time of launch to have a commercially relevant product. Now, once you have a commercially relevant product, now you have a fundable, transactable company, which means that you'll be 5% of the companies that succeed. Mm-hmm. So the aha moment here is looking at oneself and saying, we shouldn't have 50% failure in phase 3. We shouldn't blame the molecule. What if we stop blaming the molecule for a second and we blamed ourselves? And by the way, it's going back to medicine. In medicine, if you have a mistake or you have a patient, how you operate on a patient as a complication, first thing you do is you blame yourself. What did I miss? What mistakes did I make? The humility to go back and say, look, maybe I got it wrong before you blame the patient. In drug development, I think up to this point, there has been almost a get out of jail card, which is, 50% fail. And I think what we try to do at Treehill now is work with companies and say, how can we help you develop drugs better? How can we help you prevent making those mistakes? And how does that lead to you raising money? How does that lead to you consummating transactions?
Tell so the mistakes. I want to maybe dig into some stories around the mistakes. Offer some real, you know, obviation value to our listeners. And
Sure.
I know it's a tough it's not a tough question to ask. It's a tough question to answer. But give us some scenarios where, perhaps it's not a parachute in and save a specific problem challenge that you're facing with a client, but it's one of those situations where you're kind of doing that that back what do you call it? Like you're backfilling the analysis.
Yeah, you're doing a regression analysis on decision making. So if I
Yeah.
use a binomial tree as the basis for the answer, if you look at a binomial tree, the binomial tree is efficient. So if you look at each node, each in between each node, the market is highly efficient. Treehill has no value to add. Companies will do excellent work, consultants will do excellent work, bankers will do excellent work. You can't improve from a node to node decision making in the binomial tree. Where the mistakes are made is looking at beyond one or two nodes. And if you look at node 1, for example, and node 10.
Mhm.
So when you work with a company, in the first stages, they need a good scientific team who understand the science. Then you start moving into a group that needs a medicinal background and drugability background and a CMC background. Then you move into a team that actually needs a early drug development background and capabilities. And then you move into a team that needs more of a later stage drug development capabilities and commercial focused. Those teams are not the same individuals. So where we see mistakes being made is where people don't realize that their time frame of working on that drug has come to an end, and they need to bring other capabilities in on board. So and when decisions are made on incomplete and inaccurate information. So people, for example, get a great drug, they get it through tox, they get it through drugability, they have drug stability, and then you say to them, so phase 2A is where we see the most mistakes. How did you choose your indication? Well, I was at a conference and there was a KOL or a PI said, I'm really interested in pancreatic. Okay, so you've done all this work for 10 years, and now got to indication selection. Did you look at other indications? Did you look at breast? Did you look at glioblastoma? Did you look at pediatric? Did you look at ovarian? What did you look at? None of this PI told me they were really interested.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when that conversation has been had a couple of times, boards, investors, management then are almost wedded to that decision. So when we come in as Treehill and we say, okay, you've chosen indication A or indication B, have you thought about taking a step back in the node? So to go back one step in the node and say, what if we chose a different indication? Because if you look at that in the other indication, your mechanism of action could also work in endometrial, for example. Your indication could also work in glioblastoma, and your drug could be more attractive in that indication. That's an easier pathway to develop. And what we find is few companies take a step, they take a pause where they say, I've made this decision, but was this the right decision to make? Because admitting that might be a suboptimal decision is not within our DNA. Mm-hmm. So that again goes back to the humility point. So, as a scientist, you're always trying to disprove the null hypothesis. You're always going back and saying, was I right? Was I right? Was I right? Do I need to change anything? But when you start moving to drug development, and this is the aha moment, as we were working with those CROs, we realized that when companies were approaching us and saying, look, Ali and the team, we're thinking of going into indication A or B or C, we could work with them and say, look, why don't we work with you and work through which of those indications make sense? Incredible receptivity. So give you some statistics in terms of how widespread we think this is. We looked at over 1,200 studies, and that's now increased to 1,400 studies. Only 5% of the studies that we looked at were developed with a commercially targeted TPP at the time of launch. So only 5% of people have put the GPS coordinates into knowing where they were going at the beginning.
Yeah.
85% of studies had one or two material flaws. 60% of studies, it was very difficult to understand what the clinical utility of those studies were. So he's like, why are you doing this study? Oh, the FDA, I like it. Look, the FDA or the EMA isn't going to tell you not to do a study. They're there for patient safety. They're not there for efficacy or commercial relevance. So when you applied an investor's lens to it, as an investor, I don't need you to do that study. You either do a registrational study or you do a de-risking study, but you're doing a study just to generate more data. So we found that there's a huge white space, and there's receptivity as we work with CROs. There's receptivity as we work with biotechs, because one, you're preventing people making mistakes because you're testing the robustness of decisions made. Two, we can reduce the cost of a study by about 30%, and we've done it relatively consistently over the past 18 months. We've reduced the timeline of drug development by 8 to 9 months. I think we've reduced the error rate, but you never know the error rate until errors are made. But we've picked up quite a lot of things that could have been improved. The change order, as in when you start a clinical study, the industry change order is 18%. So when Ali starts a clinical study and I say it's going to be 100 million, statistically, I'm going to be spending 118 million on that study.
Mm-hmm.
Our change order at this point is low single digit. So again, if you go back to at the beginning of this discussion, why did I move into medicine? Why did I move into banking? I moved in because I wanted to get better drugs to patients in a more effective, efficient way. And for that reason, I think I'm now through, some deliberate actions and some, aha moments that I hadn't expected. I think we're now as Treehill in a position where we can work with companies and truly advise them how to get their products to patients in the most efficient, cost-efficient, and time-efficient manner.
Yeah. I want to go back to that indication decision-making process that you talked about a bit. And, short of, I'll simplify it, right? I'll dumb it way down. Like, short of me making an indication decision because I've heard from Ali 6 times at a trade show. He's a KOL, and he's like, he's giving me attention, right? That's dumbing it down. But we went that direction because that's where the attention was, and maybe that's folly. Why aren't biotechs casting a wider net and exploring more indications? Is it expensive to do? Is it challenging to do? Is it too time consuming to do? Like, why wouldn't they just naturally do that anyway?
It's a different binomial tree. You've ended one binomial tree, you've now moved to another one. So one is a scientific binomial tree. Now you need to move on to a medical one. So where in pancreas are there white spaces? Where in glioblastoma is there white spaces? Where in AMD are there white spaces? And if you are a scientist, you're not able to. Sorry, most of the scientists that we know. Let me back up for a second, and I'll be maybe a little bit more brutal to this.
Yeah.
You have a chief scientific officer typically they're very capable. They do the scientific work. Then they bring a chief medical officer on board because they go, I need a chief medical officer who's going to help me on indication selection. Now, what we've seen over the past 20 years consistently is if you hire yourself a glioblastoma chief medical officer and you look at the past 3 studies they ran, and those studies are glioblastoma studies, for example, surprise, surprise, which study do you think they're going to run for your drug?
Yeah.
And a oncology CMO is a very different beast to an ophthalmology CMO. So as you're going through things, we said, when we work with companies and we're telling them, look, your CMO selection is the most crucial recruitment event in your company's history, because that CMO will decide which pathway you go down. That CMO will work with the organization and external advisors, CROs, to set up a clinical study. That'll take them a year or two. That study will run for a year or two. So 4 or 5 years down the road, you'll realize whether you made the right decision, right clinical study design, and the right outcome. If you get it wrong, you've just made a 5-year mistake.
Yeah.
And then you've got to go back to the beginning of it. So I think what happens is people look at it in 2 dimensions. They say, I've got a drug that can go for such and such an indication. What have people done before? Oh, people have this mechanism of action. They've got into AMD. They go to a couple of conferences. They hire some good consultants, and everyone goes, yeah, AMD makes perfect sense. I don't think there is as much robustness in the decision-making process as there could be. So if we look at a couple of products in Takeda, they went down the breast cancer route. They then get picked up by the Roivants of the world and go into a completely separate indication.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at those products and we said, how did you, as a large, incredibly respectable organization, go down that route? Well, that team thought it was the right thing to do. When they generated the data, they now handed it to a new team. The 2 teams hadn't talked to each other.
Yeah.
So we see that quite often. So I think it's, again, if you're looking at drug development, you need a team that is able to have a conversation about a molecule at the same time that in the same room, someone who's actually launched a product. And yes, they're 10 to 15 years away from each other, but what you do today and tomorrow and the next day needs to be vetted by the commercial person or be relevant to the commercial person. Otherwise, you're developing a drug like a baton. You need to know where you're going.